Welcome back to Media Mak. This is Dr. Shermak here. So glad to have you here on a week 5 episode as we have entered March. We are in daylight savings time. Spring is starting to make its way in our lives, and that's super exciting. So welcome in. So happy to have you here. And I am really excited about today's episode. We're kind of going a little bit meta, because we are going to end up talking about podcasting in route to discussing radio. Radio is our week 5 theme. And, again, this is maybe one of my favorite mediums in the class and really anywhere that we talk about. It has a place very near and dear to my heart, and I'll explain that as we move through today. I want you to think about where you're listening right now. And you're not listening to radio right now. You are listening to a podcast, and maybe you're listening on your own personal device, maybe a laptop, maybe you're watching this on YouTube, maybe you're tuning in through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. No matter what, you're not listening to radio, all right? What I call radio is terrestrial radio. Sounds funky. But that means that it's radio that is delivered over the air, your AM or FM signal. I want you to think about the last time you actually listened to terrestrial radio. Maybe it was today. Maybe it was this past week. But those numbers are down from where they used to be, so it seems. Pew Research says that 82% of Americans ages 12 and older listen to terrestrial radio in a given week. 82%. Now that number is down, but I think a lot of people would assume it's much lower. It's actually still pretty high. Where we probably think it's much lower is because most people under 30 will tell you they never listen to the radio, right? And that's probably true. But remember, this is 12 and older. So terrestrial radio is still very strong when we get into some of the older demographics. Before we dive into a little bit more about demographics and the impacts they have on radio listening, let's go back in time. And your textbook, for those of you in the class, your textbook is going to take care of a lot of the history, as it always does. But there are some really important moments in radio history that I want to emphasize. And so I'm going to talk about those a little bit today in the podcast. First off, just the start of radio and the very complicated origin of radio. So this is where you have the story, and some of you may have heard of this already, of Tesla versus Marconi. All right. Tesla is this brilliant, he's very well documented inventor. And you have Marconi, who's kind of a well-connected insider. He has royal ties. Tesla had a wireless system as early as 1892, all right? But unfortunately, he lost a lot of that technology he had developed. They didn't have the cloud back then, all right? He lost a lot of that technology he developed in a fire at his lab in New York City in 1895. And that 1 year after that, Marconi jumped ahead of Tesla and got an English patent on wireless radio technology. And really from that point was credited with inventing radio. What's interesting is that Tesla, later on, 1943, so almost 50 years later, Tesla was actually awarded the patent in the United States for radio. That was 6 months after he died. Was awarded by the Supreme Court. Better late than never, I suppose. I guess the lesson here is that sometimes when you create something, there's a difference between being right and being credited with that. The connections and the money that Marconi had got him a long way in getting credit for radio, but history has been revised to give that to Tesla. There are documentaries. I think there's even a movie about it. Go check those out if you want to dig in, and there'll be more in the textbook. The history of radio is fascinating, though, because there's so much of it that aligns with democracy, which we've talked about the entire semester, and how the different mediums we've explored have grown and even helped to establish democracy. Radio is no different. There's just a lot of fun facts about radio out there. One of my kind of favorite nerdy things is, if you look at a radio station has call letters. So, for example, down the street from Cuesta, we have Cal Poly. Cal Poly has a really great student radio station, KCPR, Cal Poly Radio, but it starts with a K because radio stations typically west of the Mississippi in the United States start with a K. Those east of the Mississippi start with a W. All right, so I grew up in Michigan listening to WIRX and WNDU, so on and so forth. So where this came from, actually, it's not actually an American invention. In 1912, same year of the sinking of the Titanic, there was the London International Radio Telegraph Convention. All right, and all these countries that were gathered there decided to divide up the letters for call number or their call letters for their stations by country. And the United States was so large and such a major player in radio, they got two letters. They got K and they got W. Canada got C, Mexico got X, so on and so forth. And then they made that dividing line where, again, east of the Mississippi was W, west was K. What was interesting, though, is that radio had already begun. And the first radio station to have call letters was KDKA in Pittsburgh. It was an early exception to this rule because it started before they even had the meeting about it. So that station to this day in Pittsburgh still has a K in front of its name, even though it is east of the Mississippi. I actually own a 1935 airline radio. It's a stand-up radio. It sits on the floor. It's probably about 4.5, 5 feet tall. And it has the call letters for them on there. It has KDKA. It also has some more famous ones from around the country, WNYC, so on and so forth. So it's interesting. Every time you hear those call letters, W or K, you're actually hearing part of an international treaty that was created back in 1912. So random stuff. Maybe it'll win you some bar trivia one day. Back in those days in 1912, radio technology was coming around. After the Titanic tragedy, they were saying every vessel needs radio technology to communicate. There were also a lot of sort of hobbyists that were using radio technology. KDKA kind of grew because a guy named Frank Conrad, who was an engineer at Westinghouse, they were building radios. He was broadcasting music from his garage in Pittsburgh. And one of the Westinghouse executives realized, hey, wait a minute, we can sell a lot more radios if we're actually producing content, right? So, something that happens a lot in media is creating the vehicle for media and creating the actual pieces to put in that vehicle. So we talked about this with books, right? Amazon being the number one retailers of ebooks, they're creating the Kindle. When we get to music next week, we'll talk about this with Apple and iTunes. So Westinghouse invested very heavily early on in radio programming because they realized it could help sell radio sets and radio, the actual hardware. So the content drives the hardware sales. KDKA officially launches in 1920. And the first thing they cover is the 1920 presidential election returns. 1921, there are 5 licensed stations in the U.S. By 1923, there's more than 600. By 1925, more than 5.5 million radio sets exist in the country. So you talk about explosive growth. Usually we have about a 30-year time gap when the technology takes that amount of time to reach the masses. This took about 5 years for radio. And that kind of puts it right on par with like our cell phones as far as rapid growth. This massive growth by 1925 set the stage for what we call the golden age in radio, and that really is the 1930s, 1940s. Radio is very different sounding from what it sounds like today. There's live music, there's variety shows, there's drama, there's quiz shows. You might hear that and think to yourself, wow, that sounds a lot like TV. Well, it is, because the shows on radio were the forerunners of the shows that eventually ended up on television. And you had really the same voices on these programs broadcasting from coast to coast. It kind of unified the country. You had FDR's fireside chats. When we went into World War II, you had a lot of wartime reports from there. Some of the early history with radio had to do with sports broadcasting. And you really had the same country listening in on all of these things. One of the most seminal events in radio history happened on Halloween Eve, 1938. And it was a program put together by Orson Welles called War of the Worlds. And there was eventually I think a Tom Cruise movie of War of the Worlds. Maybe that's where you heard of it. But War of the Worlds was a major, major event, because what it did, it took H.G. Wells's work, War of the Worlds, and Orson Welles did this really dramatic reading of it on the air, but he did something very interesting. He staged it as though it were part of a live broadcast. So if you listen to it, and you can look it up on YouTube, and I'd recommend listen to maybe the first 10 minutes or so. It starts off like any other radio programming. It begins with like kind of a concert in New York City. They're playing music, and all of a sudden it's interrupted by a news report about activity on Mars and things being seen from an observatory in New Jersey and another observatory outside of Chicago. And suddenly there's just this alien invasion. Well, the people who missed the warning at the beginning that it was fiction believed this was actually happening. And over the years, there's been a lot of disputed reports. There's been a lot of reports that this was overblown, that not really that many people did that. But a lot of people believed it was real. And some people panicked, they fled their homes, they called the police, so on and so forth. What this did was hugely important for all of media, because it showed us how authoritative media can be. People listen when these things happen. They can be convinced of things by media. If I saw it on the news, it must be true, right? How many dangerous roads has that idea taken us down over the years, even to this day? So when a medium can make people believe something that is not real in real time, it tells you everything you need to know about the power and the trust that it has built. And a lot of that happening in 1938 is where we have what's called media effects research, the way media changes our behavior, our viewpoint, so on and so forth. A lot of that began with the War of the Worlds broadcast. So that's a massive development. I think another huge development in media, but very specifically related to radio, happened in the 1950s, just a few years later. The transistor. Let's talk a little bit about how this came to be. So TV arrives in the 1950s, and it's a booming moment. And we haven't even gotten to television yet. We will, but I know we've talked about it a lot. And TV kind of strips radio of everything that they had: the stars, the sponsors, the audience, that presence in a living room. It all moves to television. And just like folks have done for many years, they assumed radio was dead. And the biggest development to save radio and bring it back was the transistor, all right? So the transistor comes from Bell Laboratories. They invented it in 1947. It uses almost no energy. It's tiny, it's durable, it's battery powered. Texas Instruments takes it to market in 1953, and by 1957, Sony introduces the pocket radio. What it does is it allows radio to be mobile. It really is the first mobile media. Now, you can make an argument, you can take a book anywhere, you can take a newspaper with you anywhere. That's mobile. And of course it is. but I'm talking about an electronic media that you can take anywhere. It's sort of like the same growth we saw now with video, because you can take video with you anywhere on your phone, your laptop, whatever. So this was very technically clever. It allowed radio to go into cars. And of course, here in the United States, we're a car-obsessed society. That's a whole nother thing. But before the transistor, every mass medium required you to stop and pay attention. You sat down to read. You sat down in a movie theater. You had to sit down in the living room and watch television. With the transistor radio, it was the first mass medium device you could put in your pocket and take anywhere. You could go to the beach. You could go in your car anywhere. Take it to the job site. It changes everything. It did not just save radio. It created a whole new relationship between media and daily life, your everyday life. The idea that your media could follow you rather than you just having to sit down and consume it, and that's all that you were doing. And it's funny now, 75, 80 years later after the transistor radio is invented, this mobility is the default mode for us when we consume media. Today's media has to be mobile. It has to go with us where we want to go. But radio started it. That was the first time anyone realized, wow, people want to take their media with them. And of course, today, that's all we do. We'll get into talking a little bit about the FM format and how that evolved from this. But before we do that, let's take a quick break and we'll come back for segment 2. And I'll share a little bit about how I grew up with radio. You're listening to Media Mak. We're talking radio. We'll be right back.
Stay connected to your campus. The Questonian has been Cuesta College's trusted news source since 1966. From breaking news to campus life, we cover the stories that matter to you. Follow us at The Questonian on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, or visit questonian.com.
Welcome back to Media Mak. Dr. Shermak here. It's week 5. We are talking radio. We started off talking about some of the highlights from the history, some of the things that I think are particularly important. I'm always really excited to talk about radio because it's kind of one of the few mediums we discuss in this class and on this podcast where I feel equal amounts of nostalgia to equal amounts of hope for this. And I get it. I get a little overly excited about journalism, and I might be a little more hopeful than I should be sometimes about certain mediums. But I really feel this about radio, about the style and the delivery of radio. And I think a lot of it has to do with the nostalgia, but I do see a way forward for radio. And just like other mediums that have been discussed over the time, it isn't in the same form that we've known them, in the same form that I grew up with them. It's a different style. It's a adapted form. I grew up in St. Joseph, Michigan, which is in the southwest corner of Michigan. It's about 60 miles across Lake Michigan from Chicago. And what was so cool about that is even with my little AM alarm clock radio in the bedroom in my basement at home, I could pull AM stations from all over the Midwest, but mostly Chicago. So I grew up listening to Chicago radio and some of the great Chicago stations, WGN, WLS, WBBM, right across the lake. And it was so fun to do that and have this be in this large market, even though I was in this pretty small town 2 states away. And I learned about the world from listening to things in that market. I became really interested in weather. And so I would love listening to the weather reports, guys like Tom Skilling from WGN, so on and so forth. And it was cool because when there were storms coming, all of our weather moved out over the lake. And so when the storm would roll out over the lake, when it would lightning strike, you could hear it through the signal on the AM radio. And so I knew storms were coming, and I could hear that crackle of the lightning before I could even hear the thunder. And we knew something was approaching. And I remember that very vividly. Probably my best memories with radio have to do with listening to Cubs games on WGN. Harry Carey, Pat Hughes, Ron Santo, and those are some of the great memories of listening to Cubs games when I was out in the garage or playing basketball with my brothers or mowing the lawn. I listened to a lot of talk radio with my dad. That was always very impactful on me. And then sometimes late at night, after I had to go to bed, I would stay up and I would listen to broadcasts from around the country. Jack Buck, many of you probably know Joe Buck, his son, but Jack Buck was the announcer for the rival Cardinals, but an amazing announcer. Bob Uecker from the Milwaukee. Just being able to listen to them really, just grew my love for radio as this entertainment because it was very intimate. It was very powerful, and it stuck with me for a long time. And my point here is that radio is like this for a lot of people. The nostalgia is there. It's an intimate, local, and live way that other media just don't do as well. And so my love of radio really drove me further in life. Right now, like doing this podcast, everything that I'm doing here really is reflected in my love of radio. When I was back at Indiana University as an undergrad, I worked for the radio station there, WIUS. So there's that W again. Indiana University student, WIUS. We are AM 1570, so way up the AM dial, this little tiny signal. Our radio station was at a house. That's where we housed that. Our radio station was literally housed in a house down the street from the Union. You could only get the signal for maybe about 2 miles radius around there. But I did play-by-play for basketball. I got the opportunity to do Indiana men's basketball, which was amazing. I did some baseball. I did soccer. I did DJ shifts where I played music. And then I would come in and do sports reports, sports updates at the bottom of the hour as part of the news report. And I loved it. It was so fun. We had a fun time there. We made like fake commercials, and there was like kind of this creative freedom we had as student journalists, which we only get as student journalists. That's one of the reasons why I love student journalism so much. What stood out to me most during my time there was we were there when Bob Knight, the famous, very successful and very, very controversial men's basketball coach at Indiana. We were there when he was fired. That was September of 2000. And I remember being called at my apartment because apparently students were quote unquote rioting, which really wasn't rioting. And they were coming towards my apartment, and they called, "Oh, Shermak, are you able to get out into the street to cover the riot?" And I said, "Sure." So I carried my phone. It wasn't a cell phone. I carried it about as far as I could to lean out the door to see what's coming. And when I looked out, the quote unquote riot was coming my way. And it was pretty much 4 drunk co-eds carrying a couch. That was the riot. But I got to report on it live on the air, and that was kind of fun. And it was this huge national story, What I was witnessing there at the radio station at the time is that we were starting to go online. We had a stream of the radio station online, and we were very early with that. And it was cool. I remember being really excited about it because my parents could listen, which was awesome. And once we started to get that opportunity to stream, we had unlimited geography. Everyone could listen anywhere. And we had people tuning in, especially when we did Indiana basketball. They would tune in and listen to us from all over the country. And so just thinking about some of these memories, it's sort of what we're talking about this week playing out live, where the medium was adapting before my very eyes and the audience would follow because they wanted the content. And that's how it works, right? These mediums need to evolve. And when they do, people tend to follow. The other big change happening in radio at that time is really important to point out. And that is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And what this did was it took away ownership restrictions. And I think this is the moment the dam broke, right? You look at companies like Clear Channel, which is now iHeartMedia, and Cumulus. They bought up stations all over the country. They looked at these stations sort of just as assets, right? And they bought up local stations that had really close ties to their local communities. But they wanted these local stations to operate more efficiently, so they had a roadmap. They had a template that they would bring in, and they would just give to these stations and say, run like this. And it took away from this local flavor that they really had brought to their communities. They used something called voice tracking, where the DJs would pre-record their breaks. So much so that at many stations, no one is actually in the building. They're just running. Press play and go. The DJ who knew the town, who knew the weather, high school, basketball scores, the little nuances, that was gutted, that was gone. It was so bad that iHeartMedia and Cumulus both declared bankruptcy in the same year, 2018. They were crushed by the debt that they accrued from this buying spree. So it's sad. It's a sad story. No one won, right? They dismantled what made radio great. They took away the local flavor, and then they ended up paying the ultimate price for it. And now we have less local radio than we did before. But I do think that is about to change. And so when we come back for our third and final segment, we're going to talk a little bit about where does audio go from here? All right. We'll do that in our third and final segment. This is Media Mak. We'll come right back.
Want real journalism experience? Join the Questonian. Build your portfolio, develop professional skills, and tell the stories that matter to our campus. Enroll in JOUR 202 or 203 for 4 credits. Questions? Email thequestonian@questa.edu. The Questonian. Your story starts here.
Welcome back to our third and final segment today on radio. It is week 5. Dr. Shermak here. So glad you can join us. Let's get back into a little bit what I mentioned before the break, which was what is coming next? Where are things going from here? And you're literally in the future of radio right now. All right, because this is the podcast area. Let me try that again. This is the podcast era, and you are listening to a podcast. All right. If you're a fan of talk radio, and you've been a fan of talk radio, and I think about this all the time because I love talk radio. I think about a podcast and I think to myself, man, that sounds a lot like talk radio, because it is, right? It is. It's just in a different container. This is going back to radio's DNA, and we're just putting it in a different container. Let me throw some stats at you. All right. 42% of Americans 12 and older listened to a podcast in the past month as of 2023. That's the most recent Pew data that I could find. I have no doubt that's up. That's already up 12% over the previous decade. There's more than 1 million podcasts available, and 104 million Americans listen to podcasts monthly. And like I said, podcast is not a new idea, all right? It's radio's most essential quality, the intimate voice-driven storytelling that you hear, and there's no broadcast schedule. So it's almost better in many ways. Perhaps one of the forerunners to quote-unquote podcasting was the NPR program This American Life. And if you're not familiar, check it out. That show started in 1995. So what are we, over 30 years in? By 2020, there were more people listening to the podcast than there were listening on radio. Quality product will migrate when the technology changes. You have another podcast like the New York Times, The Daily. It launches as a podcast in 2017. It's now the number one ranked podcast among most measurements. And then they actually went to did some radio in 2018. So they're kind of bouncing around between those. There's a lot of big money now invested in podcasting. One of the most notable investments is from Spotify. And look, I understand there's some real issues with Spotify in this day and age. Look them up. I want to acknowledge that. But it's hard to ignore that Spotify spent nearly $400 million buying podcast companies in 2019 alone, in that single year. Joe Rogan, also another problematic dude, but they paid him $100 million for a multi-year deal to have his podcast exclusively broadcast through Spotify. That was in 2020. So you have the biggest music streaming company on earth, and they're doing this, they're adding this huge part of their portfolio is now becoming podcasts. It's very clear where this is going. Podcasting is a really rare combination of media that is both low budget and high impact. All right. Literally right now, I'm recording in my home office. I got a Zoom recorder. I got a microphone. I got some headphones. This cost me about $300, and I didn't even have to get all this. I could probably have done it for less. You don't need much to make this, and it can have a very high impact, lots of listeners. I'm still waiting for that lots of listeners part, but that's not why I'm doing it. All right. Thank you for listening, of course. There's almost zero barrier to entry, right? And so what this is, it becomes a total game changer for nonprofit newsrooms, local news startups, community journalism operations. They can't really afford television. Even print is too expensive, but podcasting isn't. Think about, we talked a lot about during week 3, the news desert, right? I think podcasting is one of the most realistic tools for filling those gaps. You're in areas where radio is very popular. They don't have huge budgets. Take advantage. You could have a podcast that covers city council or a school board or the county health department. That's incredible democracy first journalism that's on a budget. That's going to work. That can work. So I really think that the future of local news, I talk so much about local news, I think local news can run through audio. And not just because it's kind of fashionable and podcasting is cool, but it's affordable and it connects with audiences. And it always has. I think terrestrial radio is going to be around. People have been writing it off for years. You still have a large audience in cars. You still have a large audience among, older folks. I think its cultural relevance will continue to kind of fade a little bit. All the consolidation that happened, I talked about Cumulus, I talked about iHeartRadio, formerly Clear Channel, all that local flavor that was destroyed, I think will be able to bring back and maintain radio's success. That local connection, those local voices, local relevance. These platforms and technologies continue to change, but there's that impulse we have as humans where we love that voice in our ear. All while we're doing something, right? Driving in our cars, working around the house, whatever it may be. That draw, that connection, that's not going anywhere. So as we sort of wrap up today, I want you to think about what I said earlier, which is radio is where I have this real mix of personal nostalgia with a lot of hope. I love radio because I grew up listening to the Cubs on WGN, and I listened to talk radio with my dad. And now I'm doing this. I'm recording a podcast. This never would be broadcast over the radio, but I'm using a lot of radio styles to do it. So this medium that I grew up with in a completely different way is now this modern medium that I'm teaching with. It's really, really cool. Radio didn't die. It learned to live in your pocket. And you listening to this is proof of that, proof that it lives on. So I'm very excited about this week. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming this week. For those of you in the Journalism 200 class at Cuesta, read Chapter 5, more excellent history, which this book does so well. We have a discussion board and we have a quiz. And that quiz will cover this podcast. It will also cover the reading. So make sure to finish listening to this and do the reading before you take it. Next week, we're going to tie it very much into what we talked about this week with radio, because we're going to talk about music, sound recording, popular music, and really the impact that streaming has on that industry. So once again, thank you so much for joining me here talking radio. Continue to listen and engage. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I thank you so much for listening. Take care of yourself and those around you. So long, everybody.